Hello, everyone. We are live and recording, and you caught us laughing because we were talking about the gloriousness of Southern accents, which I'm sure will be discussed at some point during this event. But it is my pleasure to introduce everyone. Well, you already know both of these men, but we have Daryl Gregory, who is on the opposite end, and then in the center, he's going to be in conversation with Paul Tremblay, and we are celebrating Revelator, which, yes, a very happy book birthday, happy release week. The cover is absolutely gorgeous.
No, we'll talk about the cover. Dan Hillier is a genius, the guy who did that. So
it is, oh my goodness, chef's kiss. So many of you may know Daryl at our store specifically because Spoonbender was a staff pick as well as a couple of his other books. And then Paul is also known as well for The Cabin at the End of the World, Growing Things, and A Head Full of Ghosts, as well as more books. Now, for Revelator, I'm very excited. I have Southern roots, and this is a Southern Gothic that takes place in the 1930s, where we have a protagonist, Stella, who is, you know, a bootlegger, a very respectable job, and she has to return home for a funeral, and she has to face there's old family secrets. The family may or may not have a personal god called Ghost Daddy. You'll have to read to find out more about that. And there's a mysterious child, because there is nothing scarier than a small child with a lot of powers, because who knows what they're going to do with them. So this book is absolutely amazing. You guys are in for such a treat tonight. Before I pass it off, a couple house rules for everyone. If you look to the right-hand side, you will see the chat section. Hello to everyone in the chats. Go ahead and sound off there. But if you have any questions for our authors tonight, if you look down below, you will see where it says ask a question. We already have 2 questions, so huzzah! And if you have any questions, I would highly encourage you to ask them. The best part about events is that you get to interact with the authors, poke their mysterious brains, and be like, where did the weird, brilliant, somewhat disturbing, fascinating awesomeness of your horror novel come from? I need to know. So make sure you ask those questions. And then also, there is no better way to celebrate the birth of a book than to purchase it. So if you have not already purchased Revelator, I'm going to say, I'm like, wait, it's like doing this for my like tongue-tiedness. Make sure you hit the purchase book button down below. Exactly. Paul's in the perfect spot because it's literally above it. So make sure you go ahead and purchase Revelator. And on that note, I am going to pass it off to Paul and Daryl, and I will see y'all at the end of the event. Bye.
Thanks. Wow. I mean, that was like the best summary of a novel I ever could have. Like, I've already read it. Now I want to buy it.
I just wanted, before she disappeared, I meant to say thanks to Mysterious Galaxy Books for doing this and hosting it. And thanks to Constance to being our moderator, being our host and introduction person. We were just, before we started, we were talking about how sad it is to not be there in person. I love coming out to Mysterious Galaxy. I think the first book I did there was AFTERPARTY back in the day. That's maybe like 8 years ago now, but it's such a great store. It's one of the, it feels like one of the founding fathers, founding mothers, founding bookstores of the field. And thank God you're still out there doing it.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I got to visit it. I think it was summer of 2018, I believe. They're so supportive of, of horror, science fiction, and fantasy. Really, like we would have a hard time surviving without them. All right, Daryl. I didn't mean to sound so threatening there. Let's start with sort of like, so this is the birth week of your book. What was the spark? Like, what do you remember sort of the moment or moments that led to, oh, maybe this is going to be a book that I'm going to write?
Like I was telling Constance, my family comes out of East Tennessee, the Smoky Mountains, and both sides of my family came out of Cades Cove. And if everyone's ever gone to the Smoky Mountain National Park, there's this lovely area called Cades Cove, and it's just beautiful. And I thought, well, how could I wreck that by adding monsters to it? So, but the great thing about it is my family were founders in that place back in the 1800s. So you can still climb Gregory Bald, which is our mountain, go into Gregory Cave, which is where we did a little moonshining. My dad used to say there were two kinds of Gregories. There was the preaching Gregories and there were the whiskey Gregories. And so we were both the sinners and the saints back in Cades Cove. And my grandfather times 5, Russell Gregory, one of the founders, was killed by rebel soldiers. He was murdered in his home for defending the Cove against the Confederates, who were basically a starving army, and they would send raids into the Cove to steal food and livestock and stuff. So even though my family was kicked out of Cades Cove when they made it a national park, the great thing about it is I can go back there now and see the cabins, see the gravestones, the churches where they worshiped are all preserved. Like everything's there. So it's like it's waiting to be written about. And I always knew that was going to happen at some point. And then I don't remember what the exact spark was, but it was something I grew up Southern Baptist, very religious household. And at some point I had this idea and I thought it was going to be a short story where, what if your family's God, if your God was physically real, like it wasn't a matter of faith, it was there, you could go touch it, see it, hear it. And then what happens? Like how radicalized would you be? Because it would be insane not to believe at that point. And then I started to think about my own experience with religion and what it sort of the good parts it brings as far as self-esteem and feeling like you're taken care of and part of a group, and then the negative parts, which is you start to feel like maybe your group is better than other groups, and you start to get in that bubble. So eventually, all that stuff turned around to just sort of the setting was there, and then all this kind of church stuff, and especially the way I kept thinking about the way the church treats women. My mom in our church growing up wasn't allowed to vote. Like none of the women were allowed to vote. Even when they were voting on what kitchen equipment to buy, the women were not allowed to vote. The men got to decide. And so it was just a bizarre kind of, when you step away from it, the culture gets stranger and stranger. And I just wanted to talk about all that stuff. So it's kind of you put all that stuff into a mix master, and then you start seeing what comes out the other end. But that was sort of the start of it.
Wow. I think you answered every one of my questions. I'm just kidding.
That's the problem. I talked too much. Yeah, I just blew through.
No. That's perfect. Okay. So let me, there's so many places. Well, I'll go back to a few things. But, so you mentioned like, the Gregory family, and I definitely want to hang out with the whiskey Gregorys more than the preaching ones. So like, I mean, I've read a bunch of your books, and, I get asked similar questions all the time, but, since in talking to you about where the story came from and how you're using this area of the country, this big part of your family is from and have lived in for generations. Do you feel like this was like your most sort of personal story? I mean, even like, this isn't a big spoiler, but even at the beginning, our main character, Marty, comes from Chicago too, right? To the Cove. Yeah. And is that sort of like how, like you said you grew up in Chicago, but you would come down to Tennessee. So I don't know, like, do you feel like at the end of it, do you feel like, wow, I put a lot of myself into this, or it just becomes like usual, we all put ourselves into things and it just becomes something totally new?
Well, I was always coming down from Chicago into Tennessee. So I feel like I'm sort of an inside outsider, where it's like, this was my culture and my people, but I was always like sort of one step removed. And I was the weird kid who just read way too much. My uncles and aunts were like, you just always got your nose in a book, don't you? You just love to just put your nose, like it's sunny outside and you're not even going outside, are you? You're just not doing a thing. I'm like, I just want to read. Could you just leave me alone?
I'm a reading Gregory.
I'm the reading Gregorys. We're a subset. But yeah, I mean, well, and Paul, you know what this is like, where you sort of steal a bunch of things from your life. And the great thing I think about writing horror and fantasy and science fiction is you get to disguise it enough that people cannot pin you down. So you can put yourself in there without admitting you're putting yourself in there, or put other people in there because you've disguised them and you've put things off in a remove. So there's definitely a lot of me in there. But it's Stella is the female protagonist. And so that's one level of remove. And also you change a bunch of details so it doesn't really match up to your family.
Right.
So you disguise a lot of stuff. But my sister was reading the book today, and she sends me a screenshot as she's reading on the Kindle, and she shoots a picture of it and circles a passage, which is basically the way I described exactly the way my mom cleaned every Wednesday and Saturday. We had to clean a full cleaning 2 times a week. Because my parents grew up poor, and so my mom's defense against being poor was to keep a spotless house that no one could ever, take. No one could ever say you weren't a respectable family if you kept a pristine house. So you start stealing that stuff from your life and putting it in there. But certainly, I stole a lot of personal history, a lot of folklore stuff from the family, a lot of stories of friends. And, my dad died about 1.5 years ago. Well, it's coming up in 2 years, actually. And he loved the Cove. I mean, he loved walking the Cove, and he loved reading about it. And so that was a big part of growing up, was just him and my uncles and my aunts just telling stories. And so there's always a part of you, if you're a writer, where you're sort of thinking, how can I use this? There's a greedy part of your mind that's looking around for materials and magpie things that you can grab and reuse. So I don't know. What's it like for you? Is like, have you written one novel or story that's more personal than other things?
It was funny you said the word magpie, because I say that all the time. Like, I envision myself as a magpie, constantly stealing things and, hopefully building like your own sort of unique nest out of the other bits that you've stolen. It's funny. I think everything has a little bit of an autobiographical element. We were talking about Stephen Grant Jones earlier, and he has as I'm sure everyone knows, he has a new novel out this week too. And for a while, every book that Stephen would send me with a signature on it, he would say, "This one's pure autobiography." And at the time, like, this was like, well, this is about like a outer space time traveling camopede. How is this one autobiography? But now I understand what he was saying. Though I will say, my novel that's coming out next summer, called The Pallbearers Club, definitely leans, I'm going to say, like the full Jeffrey Ford autobiographical approach of a faux memoir of essentially myself on in an alternate path, alternate universe. So that was kind of fun and a challenge to really lean into the autobiographical stuff, because I was worried about falling into a trap of, oh, this is really clever because this happened in my life, but I have to stop and think, well, no reader's going to know that. Does this bit make sense for the story? For the fiction.
Right. It's still got to earn its spot in the story.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, for this book, like, after edits, I did a ton of cutting. I cut like 30 pages, which is really unusual for me by the time I get to a full manuscript. Let me continue a little bit and then we're going to go back to Revelator in a little bit more detail. But just something I noticed, because sometimes, like, we know we're putting our stuff into our own, like, experiences into books, and then sometimes you need to step back to see, like, someone else maybe even point out like what your obsessions are, or you may be aware of this. But I thought it was really interesting that I feel like this book really sort of ties well, or almost jumps off, even though there's a connection to Devil's Alphabet too. But I think, from Spoonbenders to this book, and actually quite a lot of your books, I mean, I feel like most of your stories, the ones that I sort of gravitate to, are always about these outsiders, or even families of outsiders. So Spoonbenders, obviously, this book, and it's really about Stella. She's really abandoned at the start of the book, and then sort of tries to cull together her own family, and is doing it for decades. Similarly with, they're not a family, but one of my favorite novellas of yours, We're All Completely Fine, is definitely sort of this band of outsiders. So I don't know, is that something you recognize that you're writing about frequently, or I don't know. It's not really a question. You can just respond to that diatribe.
Right. No, I mean, yeah, I can't help but become aware there are certain things that keep cropping up. And then you realize, am I already in a rut? Like, do I have anything left to say about these things? But for me, yeah, it's always about families. And like you said, sometimes it's a constructed family, like the small group therapy group, and we're all completely fine. And that stuff keeps coming back every book. And so, and for some reason, that's the stuff that I keep wanting to write about. And so I keep trying to find new spins on it, like something to say. Like a lot of times in Spoonbenders, the family really does, all of them really love each other. They fight, but they love each other. And in this book, in Revelator, I was thinking, well, sometimes these families are really dysfunctional. And I didn't have a really dysfunctional family. I just had a normal dysfunctional family that I thought, well, let's push it. Let's be a little meaner or a little tougher on the family. But it is fun when you do things and then you don't realize anyone's noticed, and then suddenly they notice, and then suddenly that's almost like a curse. That if they point it out, then you're thinking, wait a minute, right. I am doing this over and over again. If someone pointed out early on, the critic Karen Burnham pointed out, she's like, well, all your stories take place about 10 to 15 years after some other big event happened. They're usually the stories that are after the story. And then I was like, shit, she found me out. I mean, that was always for some reason, I kept getting gravitating towards stories where, like, We're All Completely Fine, they're in therapy after they've had all their terrible experiences. In Spoonbenders, their heyday was this family of psychics. Their heyday was in the past. And it's backfilling, like, what happened to the mom? Why did she die? And so, I mean, part of me is really attracted to that. And this is kind of a writer hack thing. I don't know if you've done stuff like this. Certainly you do this in like Head Full of Ghosts, where you present something as already a premise, a fait accompli. This has already happened. Mm-hmm. So so it's almost like the reader has to buy that ticket. They know right away, I'm buying this ticket. I'm going into the book knowing that's already a premise of the story. Right. So like in Head Full of Ghosts, it's already a premise that this terrible possession event has happened. Something has happened. And we're gradually excavating it through the book. And you get a lot of juice from that because the reader knows something has happened, and it's not like you're going to lead up to a big climax. Maybe the big thing, maybe you're just going to reveal what already happened. Right. And it's the horror of truly understanding it that's really going to be the emotional kicker for the book. It's not going to be having the big explosion at the end. It's going to be the revelation of it. Right.
And in a way that you could almost, I don't know, work like reverse suspense. It still is suspenseful, but sort of like, in a slightly different way. I will just at this point remind people that if you want to ask a question, we'll open up to audience questions, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. There's the ask the question sort of button. It's down below Daryl on my screen. You can just click on that and ask a question.
Yes, please.
So I want to ask briefly about Stella and Marty, obviously without giving away too much. I thought some of the central relationships, to me, the ones that I really were drawn to was Stella and her grandmother, Marty's very combative, but in a weird way, loving relationship at times. It was very complex. And in Stella's combative relationship in a different way with the patriarchal family around her, I thought both were rendered really amazingly well. But let's stick, I guess, with Stella and Marty for now. Like, were they two of the first characters you thought of, like when you started thinking about the story? Or I don't know if you want to talk about how the grandmother came about a little bit, since we've talked about Stella a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I realized early on it was going to be one of these generational stories between these generations of women. And the women were the ones who are really carrying the torch, who are doing all the work of the religion, and they're bearing the brunt of the cost. So I knew pretty early on it was going to be a generational saga between women. And somebody, I was, trying to work my way through the first draft, and I was at a bar in Seattle, and a woman at the table who's also a writer said, women tell their stories. They tell their stories to each other. They have an oral tradition that is outside of writing often. Like the official transcripts do not include a lot of women's stories. And that was a huge key for me. It was like, oh, right. So they're keeping the true story and passing it on between them. And that's going to be their bond. And also that's what they're going to be fighting about. Like the tussling over who's in charge and who gets to control the story, especially as Stella grows up and becomes a teenager and becomes the main Revelator, where Marty used to be the chosen one. And now she's passed that on to the next generation. And that tussle about who gets to feel special and who gets to be, and young Stella doesn't know the cost yet. Marty knows the cost and is trying to put the brakes on it, but Stella won't be stopped. And Sonny, the next generation, won't be stopped by Stella either.
Sure. And I think what you do really well with all of that is, at a certain level, like as we're going along, the reader sort of knows, it's not that we're on Marty's side necessarily, but we have hints that there's a cost. And the deeper we go, we know, even without being told what exactly that cost is, which is, sort of the magic of storytelling, is like you can give these hints and give space in between for the reader to sort of fill in some of those details. Okay. So I wanted to ask you about, sorry, I can't read without my other glasses. I want to ask you about the Moonshine stuff a little bit. I actually weirdly, like 3 or 4 years ago, found out that on my French Canadian side of the family, they didn't make Moonshine, but they were running illegal booze from Canada to Massachusetts in the 1910s. So a little bit of a connection, but I don't know anything about Moonshine. I want to ask you about was this like a research heavy book, or was all this like, you were talking before we got on about how like your family had involvement in moonshining or, rum running. Like, was that all just part of the family lore, like oral history, or, how much research did you end up having to do?
No, it was all part of the family lore, but I didn't know how to do it. And I was, and I was reading a lot, and there's a couple of ridiculous TV shows about moonshiners.
Right.
Where it's like, how are these guys not getting arrested? What is the scam of this show? Yeah. But my Uncle Clinton, I always knew my Uncle Clinton, for example, was a moonshiner. And so he's my mom's brother. And I hope he's not listening to this. I don't think you can get arrested right now, Uncle Clinton. You're okay. And he's also a taxidermist, and there's a huge amount of taxidermy in Revelator. And he gave it to me when I was 10. He shot that raccoon and stuffed it and gave me its head. And I've carried it with me through every single house I've lived in since then. I
like that he didn't give you like a cute, like calm expression as a 10-year-old for the raccoon. He gave you kind of a snarling, angry raccoon face.
If you people can see, it's a snarling, angry, rabid raccoon. And so I'd written most of the first draft, and I was down in Tennessee, and I said to my mom, "We got to go see Uncle Clinton," and we drove down, and he walked me through his recipe and told me stories about his, escaping the law. And my grandfather, his father, was deputized to hunt down moonshiners. So my uncle was hiding from his father a lot of the time when he was setting up these stills and running moonshine. And for my family, it's just in the 20s and 30s where a lot of the Gregorys were doing this. It was, it's just an economic transaction. You can transport a bunch of corn to town, or if you distill it, you've multiplied your amount of money that you can transport. So it just makes sense to turn corn into whiskey and then sell that in town. If you're going to hike down from Cades Cove into Knoxville to try to sell whiskey. So it's just a pure economic thing, and they just didn't take kindly to being taxed for it, because and that was the whole problem. But now in Tennessee, you can go down there, and there are licenses for moonshine, and you can buy legal moonshine. But my uncle did kindly bring out some of his wares, and we got to sample some of his shine and compare taste. So that was a lovely part of the novel.
So they're not putting on like labels with like calories and percent alcohol.
You should put a label saying this may kill you.
Yeah.
You know.
Okay. On that note, I'm going to do what I like to call the lightning round. So these answers have to be quick.
All right.
Some of these questions are totally absurd. Just so you know. All right. So, number 1, gin or whiskey?
Usually I used to say gin, but now it's whiskey.
It's a good thing you said whiskey because the interview would have been over. I'm just kidding.
Okay.
This is tailored for you specifically on your career of your books. 1-word titles or more than 1-word titles?
Oh, Jesus. Here's the thing. I either know the title when I'm writing the book, or I cannot find the title to save my life.
Yes. Oh, the best.
It's either in my pocket. It's either like Pandemonium, got it. Spoonbenders, got it. It took forever to get to We're All Completely Fine.
That's a good title, though.
Took forever to get to Revelator. There were so many different titles for Revelator. It just, what's it like for you?
I will no longer start a book without a title. Like I did it once, and it made me crazy. And it was Disappearance at Devil's Rock, and I'm still not like 100% happy with that title. That's not to say my publisher hasn't tried to make me change titles frequently. Like I think they've tried to change every book's title.
Really?
Well, yeah. Well, the most recent one, Survivor Song, you're like, I don't know. Like, do you got something else? And so then I said, all right, how about You Will Not Feel Me Between Your Teeth? And all of a sudden I was like, oh, I love that. And like, we don't want teeth in the title. We're going back to Survivor Song. And I was like in this weird position where I was fighting for the title that they made me change. But so I sort of won, but.
Well, I mean, I think Head Full of Ghosts is a brilliant title.
Thanks,
The Cabin at the End of the World is a brilliant title. I can't wait for
that one. Actually, I did change that one when I was writing. It was called The Four.
Really?
So I'm glad they suggested I changed, and I had that title sort of in my pocket. So yeah, so good job, William Morrow. I won't.
Because I want to geek out about. At some point, I just want to geek out about Survivor Song because it was such a stripped down, pure storytelling experience, and that every once in a while you read books where you're just like completely jealous, and because. Just so you know what Paul does in this, if you haven't read, please read this book, because I don't have that ability that you sort of grab people and haul me along at this pace, and you maintain this level of incident and pace throughout the entire length of the novel until you get to this, and I don't want to give anything away, but you get to this sort of coda among those two boys.
Right.
Because it was this moment of stillness in the book, killed me. Just had me crying. Literally, I was weeping. I was on a couch over there, and I was like, "Damn it, Paul! Jesus Christ!" So, I just want to say thank you for that book.
Jesus, thank you. Well, it's funny. I'll say just briefly. We were talking about being magpies. Like, one of my favorite sort of contemporary writers who isn't genre. Is Patrick DeWitt. He writes these sort of very funny comedies. He wrote The Sisters Brothers. And a novel called Major Domo Minor. And in Major Domo Minor, it's very funny and it follows this main character, but there's like this interlude in the middle of the book of this other character. And it's really strange and melancholic and beautiful. And I started just like, oh man, I want to try to do that someday. So I've been looking for a while for an excuse to try to do something like, Patrick DeWitt did. So with Survivor Song, I was like, I was actually the most excited to write that part compared to the rest of the book. So I'm so happy it worked for you.
And it ties, your books together. And so now there's like a Tremblay verse.
The Tremblay verse. Yeah. Everyone's miserable in the Tremblay verse. Okay. We're going to go back to, so these got to be rapid fire because we got questions building.
All right. Oh yeah. We got to keep going.
These rapid fire questions are so clever. I have to get through them. What's the first letter of the devil's alphabet?
Ask for Satan, I guess. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Favorite Southern.
Actually, it could be G, as in GATT. It's DNA is the devil's alphabet, so it's Gattaca.
Favorite Southern Gothic novel?
Oh,
Or
it's
the first that comes to your mind. Sorry.
John Horner Jacobs. Both books, both novellas in A Lush and Seething Hell.
Oh, excellent. Excellent collection of 2 novellas. I'm very jealous of how the first one,
God.
in particular, Robert Bolaño, like, I want to write a Bolaño novel, and he did it.
And he just did it. He just did it.
How about favorite film that would be considered Southern Gothic?
My favorite is probably, because I saw it so young and then rewatched it when I was reading this book, Deliverance, to watch a young Burt Reynolds and things just go to hell. Yeah.
Yeah. And do you remember the knockoff, the 80s knockoff that's nowhere near as good as Deliverance, but what's it called? Southern Comfort with Powers Booth. It was very much like a Deliverance. No, you got to track that down.
All right.
It's essentially like the same story, but for whatever reason, it was on HBO all the time when I was a kid. All right. Just 2 questions about Gothic. So how about goth or punk?
I got to go with goth. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I know, I'm just kidding. I know you teach a lot of workshops. You teach writing very frequently. Give one vital piece of writing advice that everyone needs. Right now.
The one that everybody's heard that was made the most to me is butt in chair. That was the biggest difference. Make room in your life somehow to write as much as you can.
Stuart Ann told me he used to literally belt himself into his chair. Like and he would set a timer for a certain amount of time, and he would not be allowed to undo the belt on his chair.
I remember reading about a guy who tied his bathrobe to his desk. Yeah.
Nice. All right. Hungry mountain god or dreaming sea squid below the sea? I think I know the answer to this one.
Well, I do have a Lovecraftian YA. I'm terribly afraid of things just below the surface of the water, so that one scares me more than even the Hungry Mountain God.
Okay, 2 questions left, and only one of them is totally ridiculous. I don't know if you're aware, Daryl. This may make you self-conscious, but you have 2 first names in your name, Daryl Gregory. You have to give me a pen name with 2 first names.
A pen name. I actually, me and Adam Christopher joined the 2 first names club, and we started teaming up together. I like John Johns probably would be it.
All right, I'll take it. We didn't get to talk much. Maybe some Hollywood questions will come up from the audience. And if not, I may ask something, since we're sort of like both floating in and out of potential Hollywood things. The Player or Barton Fink?
What was the first one?
The Player.
Oh, The Player or Barton Fink?
The Player.
Oh,
yeah, sorry.
No,
my Boston accent. The Player.
The Player. I love The Player, but I got to give it to Barton Fink because I fought with so many people about this movie.
No,
I love that movie. I have friends of mine who say this is a useless movie. It's all just phantasmagoria, and I'm like, no. This is all about writer's block. This is what it feels like.
I completely agree.
Oh.
Okay, so we're gonna go to. I never got to shout wrong. That's usually my favorite part of. I should have shouted it when you said goth over punk. All right, we're gonna go to.
Yeah, she said wrong.
Let's see. So the first question that was here was, and the person was wondering if you intended this, but the interaction with the ghost daddy sounded very sexual, or seemed sort of very sexual in nature.
Yeah, well, that's a tricky thing, right? Because there's this history in horror of that gets kind of rapey, right? And that stuff gets kind of weird. But on the other hand, when I was thinking about having a physical God, and how incredible would it be if Jesus or your own personal God could reach out and touch you? It would sort of reshape you, and so I had to have it physically in there, and I had to have it from the point of view of a young Stella who hasn't grown jaded yet, to be in love. So to see it through her eyes, even this weird pale creature, and I'm not giving too much away because it shows up in the first chapter, to to make it kind of beautiful in her eyes. If people see that as sexual, yes, but it's definitely supposed to be sensual. It's supposed to be a physical kind of body changing experience.
No, I mean, I definitely got that sense. Cue personal Jesus. That's very goth, somewhat goth. I guess we would call Depeche Mode gothish.
Yeah, I once wrote a story in which that was my soundtrack, and it was the Johnny Cash version of Your Own Personal Jesus, and I played it over and over again while I was writing that story.
Let's see. A personal question. We'll see how much you want to elaborate on this. But what was the start or initial thing that maybe had you that had you stepping away from the religious beliefs that you were brought up in?
Well, it was a growing, gradual thing, because I was in church and a believer, but also reading a lot of science fiction, and so the cognitive dissonance began to grow because the lesson of the church is there's one true way of being in the world, especially the fundamentalist church I grew up in. There's one true way of being. This is the truth. This is the way the world works. And the lesson of science fiction is everything could be different. Every single thing that you think is a premise, you could be mistaken or it could be different. And so at a certain point, I was like, especially studying religions, you're like every single culture, it becomes very clear that they invented their gods that they needed at that time. And I was like, how could we be the one people who didn't do that? So that kind of stuff sort of gets into your head. And I have a great love of the people who raised me, the church I grew up in, and especially the music I grew up with. I sang in a gospel quartet, love the music. But at a certain point, I was like, I can't in honesty stay anymore, because it wouldn't be truthful. I shouldn't be going.
Very good. Yeah. For me, I would say briefly, The Cabin at the End of the World was sort of, well, I mean, obviously Head Full of Ghosts too. That was more broad. I felt like Cabin, what it had to say about religion was more sort of personal in my worldview. Maybe sort of possibly, depending on what you look at, reflecting a fear is like, what if there was a God and he was the asshole of the Old Testament?
Yeah, I mean, that book freaked me out so much. I heard you read the opening of that book at some con we're at. So I think it was World Fantasy somewhere, maybe it was a reader con, and it's such a brilliant opening and creepy, but then it keeps becoming something else. And when you realize that all this stuff, there is something supernatural going on, that they are locked in, they do have an answer, these people who have invaded the cabin, you're like, oh shit. It's a great effect when you realize they're right, and the poor agnostics and atheists are in the dark.
Oh, thank you. But how about, I'm going to skip to these two, since there's sort of a couple that were related here. How is it writing? I'm going to combine them both, because I think you might have an answer that can sort of cover both. How was it writing a female bootlegger during the 1930s? It doesn't seem like a field that would have been female friendly, and sort of with that in mind, what was the thought behind selecting women to be the main focus of the family's power?
Yeah. Well, like I said earlier, I knew it was going to be a generational story about the women, and the way the women their stories would be sort of taken over by the men who would write things down and make it official. I was really interested in that part of the story, the unwritten part of the religion, but the moonshining. I mean, there are some famous female moonshiners, but I was interested in Stella being such a badass that, because she learned how to moonshine from her sort of uncle Abby, when she needed to grow up and make a living, this is the one thing she knew how to do well, and she would go do it, and come hell or high water. And I sort of like that.
Was there a scene or a section that felt the most cathartic or therapeutic in Revelator?
Yeah. I mean, you're hoping that by the end people feel that catharsis when Stella finally takes action. But probably the most pleasing for me was when a young Stella goes into the church, sort of like a young Jesus, going into the church and arguing with the elders, taking down the Pharisees. I like this idea of a young Stella saying, well, wait a minute, let's look at some of the things that you've just been telling me about, and let's try to look at them logically and have that conversation that I was always too afraid to have with my preachers that growing up with. And so that was sort of like something for Daryl to have. Stella is braver than I am, in other words.
Yeah. Well, not like I'm not calling you a coward, but like no. I came across, and it was in George Saunders' book about what's it called, The Swim in the Pond in the Rain, where he's taking basically through a class of 7 Russian short stories, and within the book he quotes someone from the 1800s. I forget the author's name, but the idea that the book that you write is going to be, if you're any good, is going to be smarter than you are. Which I sort of really love. And I think that, and Saunders extends that to, the story I write is a better person than I am, or braver than I am, etc. Saunders' essay about how he's more, he has more empathy when he's writing than he is in real life really resonates with me, because that's your whole job while you're on the page. And I was like, why can't I be that empathic in real? When somebody cuts me off in traffic, I don't swell with empathy thinking, oh, they must be having a really hard day and they really got to get somewhere important. I'm mostly just swearing at that guy. Right. Road rage, Daryl Gregory. That's what everyone will get. That's what everyone will take from this. A couple more. Do you feel that there has been a resurgence of folk horror stories following the success of films like Midsommar? Do you feel like this re-rise in popularity of the subgenre led you to write Revelator, or feel like it happened as an organic coincidence? And this is from Rob.
Rob, yeah, this is always kind of an accident, because the amount of time it takes for a story to go from your notebook to a draft to finally be published, it's just sheer luck if it happens to come out, or bad luck if a really great one comes out in the same saying the same things as yours. And sometimes it's just steam engine time where a bunch of stories happen to come out around the same time. But I think I was writing an essay about the Southern Gothic the other day to get ready for this press tour thing. And it's really clear that every generation goes back to some of these core stories and these same storytelling approaches and adds something new. So it's not like it's ever really forgotten. We've all read these books, and everything's sort of brewing in our heads. And all this furniture of genre, all these furniture of storytelling things are available to all of us to rearrange and sort of build our own rooms out of. And so it's no surprise that these stories keep coming back.
That's a great answer. I like that comparison. Although I hate moving furniture. Well, who loves it though? Who really says, I love moving furniture? Let's see. I'm going to ask this one and then one more.
All right.
So beauty is sometimes referred to as one of a woman's greatest asset and tool for power, but it fades with time, and there is always someone younger and more beautiful around the corner. Does this connect at all with the characters and how the title of Revelator is passed down to the younger women while the previous Revelators are still alive?
That's interesting. I wasn't thinking of beauty, but of course that's probably, this is where other people can explain my book to me better.
Sure.
But I was thinking of this idea that there's always the next generation who are going to be the chosen ones, who are going to be the next most favored children of God. And there's always going to be the next generation of writers is coming too. So I'll have to face, get out of the way. No, it was more about what happens when the next generation comes and they are more in tune. They are better prepared for communing with the God in this case, or doing whatever the task is. And so I wasn't relating it necessarily to women and beauty or men and beauty and how men also age. And I was more thinking of just when the light of God moves, the spotlight moves, and someone else seems to be the chosen person. What does that feel to the people who are left behind? They love the God. If you're a religious person, you would say this is really good for our kingdom that this is happening. But on the other hand, it's not you anymore who's really pushing forward. So it's a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed and was drawn to Marty and how it felt to me it was like a struggle between power and fear. I mean, part of it was fear of what Stella was getting into, but also, fears of today too, like, what the patriarchy was going to do to Stella if she got too powerful, but at the same time, Marty still, I think, also was maybe lamenting a loss of her own power too. And that can get really messy and complicated in interesting ways, especially, with a forced relationship, or even if it's a familial one, one.
I almost treated Marty and Stella as sisters that were sort of competing in a way. The one sister and Stella was the new best chosen one, and the jealousy, and also the mix of jealousy and protectiveness and competitiveness, and their scenes were a lot of fun to write because it was so much in turmoil. Like every sentence could sort of turn, and as it went drafting it, they could get more and more interesting, make every sentence sort of count because they're always poking at each other. They know where each other's buttons were, so they were a lot of fun to write.
Right. Okay, so I sort of lied. I'm going to ask. I do want to ask a Hollywood question, then I'll ask the last question that's on here. I don't know. Is there anything Hollywood-wise you can talk about with either Revelator or previous works that anything you can share?
Yeah, you and I had an email conversation about this where it was like, Hollywood comes along and they pay you some option money, and then things seem to be going along, and then things can go off the rails at any moment. I've had so many things that people were saying, this is going to be great, and then it would just sort of disappear. One of my things got canceled because the head of television said some racist stuff on a conference call. She was fired. All her projects were canceled, including mine. Mm-hmm. And it was like, it had nothing to do with my thing, really. She just ruined it for me. So Spoonbenders right now, we were at Showtime. I don't even know if I'm allowed to talk about this, but they're back on the market. The Berlanti Studios is still trying to develop it. We still have a showrunner and some great scripts, multiple versions of scripts. That's still going. And then Revelator, I'm starting now writing the pilot stuff, and we've got Warren Littlefield Group is trying to develop that. And so, but it's almost a mistake to ever talk about this stuff because everything can go away in a moment and disappear. So I feel like my job is to not get too excited, keep my head down, keep writing the next book. And if something happens, great, but don't count on it.
No, definitely. Yeah, definitely don't count on it. But, at the same time, I feel like, it's fun to talk about because it may never happen. And like, if you were just silent and never celebrated possibilities the whole time, that's kind of sour experience as well.
It is a terrible. I just want to be a television writer for the Writers Guild of America Insurance. I just want to. I just want that sweet insurance.
Oh, that's a good point. All right, that has to go into my plan of
right. That's why Paul. That's why we have to form our own production company and start making our own show, so we can at least get the insurance. We may go broke trying to get our own insurance, but this may be a path for us.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I would say briefly, Survivor Song's been optioned, hasn't been announced by anything, so I can't say by who. Headful of Ghosts has been under option with the same production crew since 2015. So who knows? It would have filmed last summer if not for our pandemic.
Oh, you were ready to film. You were ready to go.
Well, yeah, they had like foreign distribution money. They had a director. They had some casting. But then, things, as you said, fell apart, but they're still trying to get it going. Right now, Cabin definitely feels the closest, but I can't really say anything about it. Or I'll ruin it.
Knocking on wood.
Okay, so let's end with the quintessential horror question, but it's a good one because I'm interested to hear what you say about this. I've always loved that Stephen King considers Pet Sematary the scariest thing he's ever written. For both authors, what book or short story of yours do you think is your scariest?
I have to confess something. I don't think I'm a real horror writer because nothing I write scares me like Paul's stuff. Like, one of the problems I have is that I keep inserting humor, and then I'll get distracted by these other ideas in the book, and I'll sort of lose track of. I had you by the neck. Like, why didn't I just keep you there for longer? And so. But I will say that sometimes in the process of rewriting, I lose track of what's actually scary. And then somebody will read it and saying, like somebody was really upset by some of the scenes and we're all completely fine. There's a woman who cuts her arm open to see what's been written on her bones. I think that's
an amazingly disturbing and disturbing novella. Certainly. Horror.
Yeah. By the 10th time you rewrite that scene, you've totally lost track of it. You're just trying to get the image right.
Right.
And I've lost track of the visceral part of it,
Yeah. I honestly, like, I certainly don't use the scare to define horror because what scares somebody is so subjective.
That's a good
point. Just like what's funny is subjective. You can intellectualize it. Oh, that was supposed to be scary or supposed to be funny. But I really honestly never think about, is this scary or is it not scary? I just try to, like, the things I feel like I can control. Is it disturbing? Does it move? Hopefully, does it move the reader emotionally? And then if it scares somebody, great. But I feel like I have less control over that.
That's a really good point. And I think if you stay in the moment, I think where I keep getting drawn back into horror type premises is because it's so dramatic, and if you stick really close to the character's moment by moment feelings, it gets led into the graphic and the body, because bodies are weird and crazy anyways. And so there's some, people will say, wow, you wrote this really graphic scene, so that is horrible, and that's body horror. But all you're trying to do is be as clear as possible. Right. This is what it looks like when they have this disease or when this is happening. I wrote an entire novel that had entirely too much pus in it from Devil's Alphabet, and
there's a lot of pus.
Yeah, I was trying to start a new subgenre.
Pus punk. It's hard to say.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think that's why it never took off.
No, that won't be our first joint production company. Pus punk.
Pus punk.
Okay, I think on that note, maybe we'll call it an evening. Thank you, Daryl. I hope everybody, please read Revelator and all of Daryl's other books. They're amazing. He's one of my favorite contemporary writers.
And everybody read Paul's book and buy them. Yeah. Survivor Song, the latest, is an amazing. Like I said, it just grabs you and pulls you along. So, but read everything.
And that makes my job easy then on the bookseller part, because you have two amazing authors, everyone. So go out and purchase their, luckily not pus-filled books, because I'm not going to lie, pus is just icky. And that would make a good ska band name, though, when you said that. I was like, oh, Pus Punk would actually be a really good ska band. So keep an eye out for that, everyone. I'm sure they do merch and everything for it. But a very, very happy book birthday to Revelator. And everyone, go check it out. It's as beautiful on the inside as on the outside. We didn't get to talk about the cover.
Check out Dan Hillier. He made this cover while listening to an audio version of the book. Mm-hmm. And I'm just so happy. He's an incredible artist. Go find him online.
So go check out all of the things, everyone. Go read the amazingly chilling novels to help you cool off a little bit during the heat. I know, cheesy bookseller line there, but I have to throw it in there. And on that note, we will say thank you so incredibly much to Paul for all the amazing questions, and to Daryl for celebrating with us, and to everyone for their questions. So have a lovely night, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.
Good night.